So we've created our provide question API, which in this case we're instantiating a retrofit builder and passing in the JSON converter that will convert the JSON into serialized JSON objects, which then are internally connected to our models here, question and question item. Okay, so all of that is going to be done internally. Otherwise, if we had to do this ourselves, we'd have to create a lot of different classes just to get things to work. It's not worth it. So using a library is always a good idea. And retrofit fits the bill. All right, so what we do next is we're going to create a repository. So inside of a repository here, I'm going to right click, new class, and let's call this question repository as such. Very good. Now, because we have HILT, I'm going to inject, say @inject constructor as such. And because it's a repository, I need that question API, right? Because the question API will know how to go and get that information that we need, which is the data. Okay. Or at least we'll have the structure that will allow us to do so. So let's go ahead and import that inject. And here I'm going to say private val, and it's going to be an API. Just call our question API such. Very good. All right. So this is where we then are able to, again, if you go back to model, let's go to question API, where we're going to invoke this question, get all questions. Think of this as a DAO, right? Data access object. That's what it is. We just call this API, but we could have very well called it DAO, because this is what connects directly to get all questions by invoking the get and go to this path, which then in the background calls retrofit to get the data from our JSON API. That's what it is, really. So in our question repository here, this is where, first of all, we're going to go ahead and create a private val here called, it's going to be list of questions. Okay. And in this case, this is going to be an array list of question items, like that. Okay. And in the beginning, you're going to just have an empty list as such. Now, although this will work, because indeed we're getting an array list of question items, right, from our API, but we need to think a little bit about what is it that we are trying to get, or what other information we may need, especially when we are dealing with getting information from the internet or getting the information from anywhere, really, data in our applications. So let me show you something real quick in a little presentation. So the way things are, we would have an array list of question items, as you see there. So that will be coming from a JSON data source. In this case, it's going to be an API somewhere remotely, or could have been a file, or a JSON internally, or a JSON file internally inside of our app, or a database. It doesn't really matter, right? So we're getting that information, and then of course we're expecting to get an array list of questions. One thing we need to think about is okay, can we attach a little bit more information to what the data that we're receiving? Because at this point here, if we just pass an array list as such, array list containing a question item, it's totally fine, it works great. But in this case, we can't add any metadata about the response itself we're getting from the server. For instance, if there's an exception that happens as the data is being pulled in, right? Or want to know the status of this process of fetching data from our database or from our data source, I'll just call it, right? And many other things that we may want to attach to this array list. The way things are right now, it's virtually impossible. You can make it work, but it's going to be, we'll have to do a little bit more work, unnecessary work, to make it so that we can pass those pieces of data, information that we may need in our user interface to know exactly what's going on with this payload of data that we're receiving. What we need to do is to wrap this array list into a different object, right? So in this case, we could call it data or exception. What this does, you can see I have angled brackets there. What this does is that we can pass first a T, in this case it's going to be a generic, which is very convenient because that means we can pass any type that we want. in place of that generic, we can pass an array list of question items, which is exactly what we have there, right? And on top of that, we can then pass a Boolean that we can toggle if loading is true or loading is false, so that when we transpose this data onto our user interface, our composables, we can then extract that information. So if load, for instance, is true, because we had added that information in our data or exception, we wrapped everything inside of this main object, right? Then we can extrapolate that information to say if it's true that it's still loading, then we can show some sort of user, show something to the user so they know something is still loading. If there are problems that happen, for instance, certain exceptions have happened, we can also pass them as you see there. So now not only can I pass the actual data, as you see, array list, or could it be array list of strings, or could be array list of person objects, whatever it is, doesn't matter because it's a generic, right? We can also pass the Boolean, so we can say, okay, if it's loading or not, and any other exception. Also, virtually, we can pass any other type we wanted, just so we can wrap our array list here, because we know we're getting information from the web or from a data source. We can wrap it with more metadata or more information around it, so we can extrapolate when we are now using this data into our composables. Now, again, it looks like overkill because, like I said, we could have just stopped at the array list question item and call it good. But this process of wrapping our data into another class that allows us to add more data to that class, right? So we can unwrap it and get different parts of the data. It's partially part of the clean architecture. Let's go ahead and put this data or exception structure so we can see how it all works. All right, so we are going to take a little break from our question repository because we need to create another structure here, right? The wrapper class. So inside of our data, I'm going to right click and say Kotlin class as such. Let's call this data or exception as such. Okay. Now I'm going to make this a data class because it's just a simple data class, data or exception. Now, what is that we want to do here? Now we're going to use generics. Now I've talked about generics before, but essentially generics allows us to, as the name implies, make our class as generic as possible, meaning we can pass different types in place when we want to implement this class. So for instance here, I'm going to put inside of angle brackets, I'm going to put a T, and I'm going to also put a Boolean, and then I'm going to put an E to say it's going to be an exception type like this. Right? I'm going to say Kotlin exception, that's fine. And then, because this is a data class, we don't even need the body. Let's go ahead and pass in the constructor, primary constructor here. So what I'm going to do, well, again, what I'm doing here, I'm just saying this data or exception data class here would allow any template type. So this could be string, this could be a person type, this could be any type that we want. Boolean, of course, is going to be Boolean only, and E is going to be of type exception. That means then this is going to be our wrapper class. So I'm going to pass here, say var, for the data field, I'm going to pass the T, make it nullable, like this. And for the Boolean here, it's going to be loading, or I could say loading state, it doesn't matter. So loading, it's fine. It's going to be a Boolean type. Okay, also be nullable, and it's always null at first. And var E, this is going to be for our exception. I'm going to say E type and also null like that. Right, there we go. So this is what we are going to use. And the great thing again about this is that whenever we're getting data, in this case in our question repository here, instead of just passing in array list of questions like this, we can wrap this, as I showed earlier, into this data or exception, which means then I can then pass metadata as I get information. I can say, for instance, for data property, I'm going to pass any type here. In this case, it's conveniently, we can pass this whole list here of question as this T type. That way, then if I want to get the information to show, I can say data or exception dot data, and I would have access to this list. What I mean by that now is that we'll have to change a few things here. we get a wrap. I'm going to say data or exception. There we go. And then I can pass all of this. I can just remove that actually. In our angular brackets there, that's the first data, the T. Let's finalize like that. And then I'm going to pass just a boolean, could be anything. And then I'm going to pass an exception. So in this case, just going to be exception, Kotlin exception as such. And then I'm going to just have an open, an empty constructor like this. There's a new line, so it's more visible. Now we wrapped our array list question here, but we added that inside of our data or exception type, so that our list of questions is going to come as this type, data or exception, which means it's going to have the data if there is data, but also we can pass a boolean to say, oh, it's still loading or not loading, and an exception if there are issues. So in the next video, we'll continue constructing our question repository here, which really is not going to require a lot of things because it's a very simple application. All we're doing is just getting information, and we're not editing it, we're not deleting, we're not updating, we're just getting the information from our API. But this is an important concept. So I would like you to take a look at this and implement anytime you find yourself in a situation where you're getting data of some sort, right? You wrap that into some structure like this. That way you can pass bits of information along with your main information, which in this case is our array list.